This is the story of the largest dam removal project in American history, a river that 4 dams held captive for over a century, the indigenous tribes who spent decades fighting to bring those dams down, and what the river did the moment the last barrier cleared. Within 10 days of that final removal, more than 6,000 Chinook salmon pushed upstream into water their species had not touched since 1918. Klamath River stretches 400 miles from its source in the volcanic Cascades of southern Oregon to the Pacific Ocean in northern California, and for thousands of years it ranked as the 3rd most productive salmon river on the entire west coast of the lower 48 states. 6 federally recognized Native American tribes built their entire cultures around the salmon that moved through it every season. And then, between 1918 and 1964, 4 hydroelectric dams went up on the lower river without tribal consent, blocking over 400 miles of spawning habitat. Salmon populations collapsed to less than 5% of their historical numbers, and a fight began that would take more than 2 decades to win. What that fight produced was the largest dam removal project in United States history. What the river produced after that surprised everyone. The river that was taken. 4 dams went up across the lower Klamath between 1918 and 1964, each one adding to the damage the last had started. Copco number 1 arrived in 1918. Copco number 2 followed in 1925. J.C. Boyle came in 1958. An iron gate, the tallest of them at 173 feet, closed off the last stretch of accessible water in 1964, cutting fish passage to more than 400 miles of spawning habitat that the Yurok, Chinook, and Hoopa Valley tribes had depended on since before recorded history. Blocking the fish was only part of the damage. Those reservoirs functioned as heat traps, collecting warmth through summer and bleeding it slowly into autumn, keeping water temperatures unnaturally high and pushing the fall Chinook run weeks past its historic timing, and the same still, overheated water bred toxic cyanobacteria every summer, the blue-green algae that spilled through the dam gates and spread downstream. The dams also cut off endangered sucker fish, the sawam and koptu, that are sacred to the Klamath tribes, from their ancient spawning grounds in Upper Klamath Lake. Amy Cordalis, a Yurok attorney who spent her career pushing for removal, described picking up a rash just from fishing in the river. That is what the water had become. And then came 2002. Tens of thousands of adult Chinook died in a single catastrophic fish kill on the lower Klamath that year, with some counts reaching as high as 70,000, making it the largest recorded kill in the river's history. And for tribal communities that had already spent decades watching the decline, that year drew a line. Barry McCovey, who has run the Yurok tribe's fisheries department for 25 years, described it after the dams came down this way. The fish had been cut off from roughly half the river they had used for thousands of years, and populations crashed almost overnight. The fight. More than 2 decades of sustained fighting went into what happened on the Klamath in 2024, drawing on tools that had rarely been combined at this scale: traditional ecological knowledge, treaty law, environmental litigation, and political pressure running in parallel across an entire generation of advocates. The legal foundation stretched back to 1864, when a treaty between the Klamath tribes and the United States locked in fishing, hunting, and trapping rights. Rights that a 1983 federal court ruling confirmed still applied, and the tribes arriving at the negotiating table decades later carried documents that predated the dams by 50 years. They were not requesting something new. They were collecting on a debt. 2019 brought something that had almost no precedent in American law. That year, the Yurok tribe passed a resolution granting the Klamath River itself legal personhood, recognizing its right to exist, flow freely, and maintain a clean environment, with the tribe empowered to defend those rights in court. A river with legal standing. That is what the Klamath became under Yurok law, and that framing changed the terms of the fight. Karuk, Hoopa Valley, Shasta, Klamath, and Modoc peoples fought alongside the Yurok throughout, and in the early years of the campaign, Hoopa Valley and Yurok high school students launched a ceremonial salmon run, carrying carved wooden salmon the full 350 miles of the river to put the story in front of audiences who had never heard it, a run that eventually drew as many as 1,200 participants. The settlement that finally ended the standoff brought together the tribes, California and Oregon, conservation groups, commercial fishing, Fishers and Pacificorp, the utility that owned all 4 dams, and had concluded that removal cost less than modernizing structures that could no longer meet federal fish passage and water quality standards. Governors Gavin Newsom and Kate Brown signed the final agreements in 2020. Out of that agreement came the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, a nonprofit established to run the project, with Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approval secured in November 2022. Total cost landed at $450 million, with $50 million held in contingency, an agreement Amy Cordalis described as one that equally values the rights of nature, indigenous peoples, and businesses. The removal. The Elwha River Dam removal in Washington had shown what was possible. The Klamath would test it at 3 times the scale. Copco No. 2 came down first, the smallest of the 4 at 33 feet, with removal finishing in November 2023. And water moved through Ward's Canyon for the first time in nearly a century. Nobody was watching the fish counts yet. That came later. January 2024 brought the drawdown of the 3 remaining reservoirs behind Iron Gate, Copco No. 1 and J.C. Boyle, overseen by the Bureau of Reclamation and monitored by NOAA Fisheries. And by February, the draining phase was done, with the Klamath cutting new channels through sediment that had accumulated over a century, feeling its way back toward the alignments it had held before the dams arrived. Restoration crews spread climate-adapted native seed mixes across the exposed reservoir beds as the water pulled back. Iron Gate was last and largest, a 173-foot earthen structure built from approximately 1 million cubic yards of earth and rock, and dismantling it demanded 25,000 truckloads of material hauled out by Kiewit crews working through spring and summer. August 28, 2024 was when it ended. The final cofferdams at Iron Gate and Copco No. 1 broke open, and the Klamath ran unobstructed from source to ocean for the first time since 1918. Leif Hillman, a Chinook tribe member who had spent decades pushing toward this moment, stood on the overlook watching the first ceremonial scoop pulled from Iron Gate, and told reporters there had been many times he had not believed he would live to see it. He was standing there when it happened. Removal finished ahead of schedule. That timing mattered more than anyone had anticipated. What came back? 10 days after the final in-water work at Iron Gate wrapped up, sonar captured more than 6,000 Chinook salmon moving upstream past the former dam sites, pushing through water their species had not touched in over a century. Nobody had predicted the return would start that fast. More than 9,600 fish crossed the threshold of the former Iron Gate site over the weeks that followed, with an estimated 7,700 of those being Chinook, averaging 588 fish per day. And on October 21, 2024, wildlife officials from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Yurok tribe's fisheries team logged Chinook salmon in Oregon's Klamath Basin for the first time in over 100 years. The fish had not just come home. They crossed a state line doing it. Tribal fishermen started calling the returning salmon footballs, a nickname earned by how large and solid the fish looked, a condition tied directly to cooler water temperatures. Now that the heat trap reservoirs no longer existed, the river cooled from the top down again, fed by cold springs in the upper reaches, exactly the way it had worked before 1918. Salmon were only the beginning of what moved back in. At least 4 species entered the river and its tributaries above the former dam sites. Bald eagles tracked the fish upstream, and documented increases in bear, beaver, otter, and osprey activity spread along newly accessible stretches. One species returning pulled a whole food web behind it. Water quality shifted faster than any model had projected. Toxic algae blooms that had choked the reservoirs every summer and spread contamination downstream began clearing once the still water conditions feeding them disappeared, and Jenny Creek, a cold, spring-fed tributary that had pooled into a sluggish, algae-choked backwater at the Iron Gate Reservoir's edge, now runs clean over boulders with young willows already rooting along the banks. By 2025, the estimated adult Chinook run above the former Iron Gate site reached 11,722 fish, and over 2,000 acres of former reservoir bed had been reseeded with native plants in the largest riparian restoration effort ever attempted in the United States. The paddle. June 2025 brought a group of indigenous youth from the Yurok, Chinook, Hoopa Valley, and Klamath tribes to the headwaters of the Klamath River, kayaks loaded and pointed toward the ocean. Trained by the nonprofit Rios to Rivers through its Paddle Tribal Waters program, they were about to become the first people to paddle the full 400 miles of a free-flowing Klamath from source to sea. Elders from multiple tribes gathered at the launch to offer blessings, and former Yurok tribal chairperson Susan Matson, who had spent decades as a fishing rights activist, stood before the group and called them heroes, the first to traverse a river that had not run free in living memory, the ones who would carry its story to people who had never heard it. Moving in the opposite direction at the same time were the first generation of newly spawned salmon, fish, whose parents had returned in fall 2024 to spawn in the upper river for the first time in over a century, now making their own first run to the ocean. Two returns on the same water, moving toward each other, happening at once. Kia Wiki, a Yurok and Maury high school student who completed the full paddle, described running Ike's Rapid in the lower river, and then said the hardest part of the journey had nothing to do with the whitewater. Carrying the prayers and wishes of her people with every stroke, she put it, was what weighed on her most. The unfinished chapter. Fall Run Chinook returned fast, in numbers that genuinely surprised the researchers monitoring the river. What did not come back the same way, and what keeps the Klamath story honest, rather than simply triumphant, is the spring Chinook. Historically, the largest Chinook population in the entire Klamath Basin, wild spring run numbers have fallen to just a few hundred fish. Spring Chinook used the upper river as their primary spawning ground before 1918, exactly the habitat that sat behind locked gates for over a century, and with the dams gone, that water is accessible again for the first time. Researchers are watching closely, but a population that small does not recover on its own timetable. An active intervention beyond simply reopening the river may be required. Two dams still stand at the base of Upper Klamath Lake, Keno Dam and Link River Dam, both serving irrigation and flood control functions that make their removal far more contested than the four that came down in 2024. The Klamath does not yet run free from its actual source. And nobody predicted the wild horses. Over 100 of them have settled permanently into the former reservoir beds, grazing through the native plantings restoration crews are working to establish, with Siskiyou County's open-range law making removal legally complicated. The restoration is working against problems that were never in the original models. Barry McCovey put the larger picture plainly. Dam removal is a massive step in the right direction, but one step in the journey toward full balance and restoration of the Klamath system still has many ahead of it. Why this matters beyond the Klamath. Tribes fighting to free the lower Snake River in the Pacific Northwest are already carrying the Klamath result into their own fight as proof it can be done. A coalition of Columbia Basin tribes, fishers, and clean energy groups announced a new initiative in 2025 targeting the Snake River dams, and the Klamath outcome is the evidence they place on the table. A $450 million private settlement funded the removal. The project wrapped ahead of schedule. Salmon arrived within 10 days, and the toxic algae that had poisoned the river for decades started clearing almost immediately. What the Klamath demonstrated at a scale nobody had tested before is that removing a dam does not simply stop the damage. It sets the river free, and a free river already knows what to do next. Vancouver stopped mowing certain patches of parkland and bee populations doubled. Centralia's residents left and butterflies colonized the empty lots. 10 days after the Klamath dams came out, the salmon came home. The same pattern across entirely different places and entirely different kinds of damage. Nature does not need much of an opening. On the Klamath River in the fall of 2024, 10 days was enough. If you want to go deeper on this one, look up the Klamath River Renewal Corporation and follow the work of the Yurok, Chinook, and Hoopa Valley tribes who drove this fight across more than 2 decades. Amy Cordalis and Barry McCovey have both spoken at length on the record and are worth finding. Rewilded covers nature coming back in rivers, ghost towns, cities, and places people have written off, backed by real research and real numbers. Subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel grow. Drop a comment and tell me the river, the forest, or the place you most want to see come back. I read every single one. See you soon.